Welcome back. We're analysing the national budget from all angles this afternoon, and we now take a look at it through the political lens. And for that, I'm joined by Susan Boyson, political analyst at Wits School of Governance, and Asanda Ngwasheng, political analyst. Ladies, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. As mentioned this is, the political panel, and we're looking at budget from the political lens. We are, of course, walking into this budget, or rather walking out of this budget where there's less politics at play, right, compared to what we did see last year. So let's start with you, Susan. Just your reflections on what we got out this afternoon.
Yes, thank you very much. It was indeed a different world from what we had a year ago. A year ago, there was a cancelled budget speech, and it was a very uncertain identity as to whether it is actually a government of national unity style coalition that was in power, whether the ANC was acknowledging it, and it had clearly been shown that the ANC at that stage still worked with the feeling that it alone was in government and it need not consult. Much political learning, coalition politics learning, has happened in government in the past year. There has been extensive consultation. Various players, cabinet players and other players, have been assuring us in comments that they've made before and after the budget. And we see it in the content too. And there is a different style in this one, in a way, reflecting the new political reality. It is what it is. It is a coalition. It's a compromise-style government, and it is certainly not a populist government. It is certainly not a government budget in which the ANC overplays its own role. It acknowledges the weaknesses, also many weaknesses that the opposition parties, and particularly those in the coalition government, in the GNU, have been pointing out. So I think it was a conservative liberal style budget, but it had many of those components that are required in the global and investment context in which we operate. It recognized that we work with a weak state and that there was much improvement required. It had something for the middle and working classes. And it had something modest, I think, and probably not enough that we've heard about today, this afternoon, but it also had something, at least, for example, in terms of increasing grants, etc., for unemployed and lower working classes as well.
And we'll circle back to the grants. I just want to get your sense of the budget, Asanda, how you characterize the political tone going into, the second budget under the GNU, especially as we head into those local government elections later this year.
Thank you so much. I don't think it was surprising that it was going to have the tone that it has. It's a lot more fiscally conservative a budget, because there is the balance between trying to deal with the fact that our debt ratio is quite high at 78.5%, and the government has to find a way to service that debt while also continuing the social spending in terms of grants, in terms of education, and in terms of health. But of course, it still leaves the main question always, which is that South Africa has never struggled with allocations. We've always had the funds to do things. The biggest issue is what happens to those funds and how those funds are managed. And I think, the Minister of Finance did try to allude to the fact that they are aware that funds are allocated to municipalities, to provinces, and for disaster management, for example. And then what happens is those funds are sent back to national, and the municipalities or the provinces get another kind of rollover of a budget, and yet the people who needed the funds still have not been able to access them, which then leads to protests, which leads to high dissatisfaction over service delivery, because that bridge that went, even though it was budgeted for, it was funded, does not exist in the area where it's supposed to be. And so I think that it was a good budget. It was fiscally conservative. It wasn't surprising, but I think that we're going to need to figure out as a country, how do we balance the importance of allocations with ensuring that we don't only rely on just what's already in the PFMA in terms of distribution, allocation, and how to manage, but also that there are consequences, because this has always been the issue of South Africa, that there are no consequences for having money and not using it for people. And, we know in the Eastern Cape, for instance, children have been dying of malnutrition, not because there is no funding for food and food security, but because it's not going where it's supposed to, never mind that it then also gets swept up in the corruption and ends up in people's pockets instead of delivering food where it's supposed to go.
And let's talk about some of President Ramaphosa's ambitious reforms that he laid out in SONA. Was there better alignment, Susan, this year between the president's political vision as well as Minister Godongwana's fiscal numbers?
There was some alignment, yes. I do not think it was a perfect alignment. Of course, both these are relatively modest, short speeches. And it's very difficult to do justice to the detailed allocations, what can be matched with what. I've heard one commentator, for example, saying that there were between 10,000 to promise of 10,000 labor inspectors, but there's no budgeting for it today. Much of those kinds of details will definitely follow in the months to come when we get to the departmental budget votes. So it's only then that we will really be able to say. But I think in broad spirit, the two speeches, both very important ones, manage, and they are aligned. I think in a general thrust, in both I sense get a very welcome sense of realism. And that work that has to be happening from now on and in the state. And as Asanda very correctly says, there are many slip that can happen between today's allocation and what eventually materializes, because misappropriation and misallocation and misbehavior, all the negative words, can very much still happen in the months that are to come in the rest of this year. And the structure, yes, I mentioned that the minister mentioned allocations to strengthen structures, the police, the judicial system, SARS further strengthening, for example. But such restructuring and restructuring and rooting out the old bad habits can take a very long time. And it's so important that the state, a government leading the state, be able to run with it while we have with these windfalls of commodity prices and Trump tantrums that really weaken the dollar and strengthen the rand, and commodity prices, which is a wonderful benefit for South Africa in this case, which meant that the minister could make announcements of good tax bracket concessions, for example, of exemption, raising of the VAT threshold, for example. And those kind of concessions would not have been possible had it not been for the global circumstances. Of course, we've also heard outgoing Commissioner Kieswetter remarking that it is SARS' meticulous efforts and good work that he thought that is responsible for about 2/3 of the better income in the coffers, money in the coffers. I would suspect it's a bit lower than that, but he did play a role. But these are unique international fiscal conditions, which South Africa is very lucky to experience at a time when the country heads into local government elections. And we know from public opinion polls that the voting public do like the coalition government and do think that more wisdom and better range of policy options are entering into the fold.
Yeah, so the GNU finds itself in somewhat of a sweet spot. Asanda, a quick one here. Let's look at some of the spending priorities, right? Following reduced US funding for programs like PEPFAR, provinces are expected to repurpose their budgets. I don't know, does this create political and social risk, particularly in the health system?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've been looking at the numbers, for instance, for health, education, and other social spending over the Mbeki era, the Zuma era, and the Ramaphosa era. And for each successive government, South Africa has increased its spending. But the problem is that the outcomes have not matched the
Yeah.
increase in spending.
Okay.
And also, a lot of the education bill, for example, is really just money being spent on increasing people's salaries. So the actual system is not being necessarily improved. You're just making sure that people continue to be employed, which is a big issue that we have in South Africa, that we are one of the countries that spend a lot of money on education, a lot of money on health, but we don't always get what we put in. And we know now, because of the Madlanga Commission, for example, that part of the problem or the reason why we're not getting the outcomes that we are funding is because of corruption, as
Yes.
we saw with, the Tembisa story and the many other stories across the country if we were to start doing that work. And I think that that's why I spoke of the issue of South Africa has never had a problem with funding and allocation and even redistribution. It's always been an issue of implementation. And if you've ever listened to the Auditor General speak, they'll tell you that one of the biggest problems of South Africa is that even if not a penny was spent on corruption, the fact that people sit with budgets for the whole year and return them to fiscus is something that is actually a moral corruption issue.
Yeah.
Because effectively what it means is that people are denied services when the funding and all the resources needed to deliver those services exist. And that is one issue that the government is going to have to deal with, because we can't just keep doling out cash if that cash is not going to be used for what it's used for, or is not going to be used at all. And there has to be consequences for inaction as much as there are consequences for action.
All right, let's leave it on that note. Susan Asanda, thank you so much for your time and sharing your analysis with us. That was Susan Boyson, political analyst at the Wits School of Governance, and political analyst Asanda Mwasheng. We're heading into a short break, but when we come back, we take a look at the key tax takeaways from Budget 2026. Stay with us.